Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 5th session of HathiTrust Community Week 2020. I'm Sandra McIntyre, the Director of Services and Operations for HathiTrust, and I'll be your facilitator for this session. I'm glad to see you all here representing many of our member libraries around the world, and we have a great session in store for you. In a minute, I'll be introducing today's speaker, Chris Prom, who is Associate Dean for Digital Strategies at the University of Illinois at Urbana Champaign. But first, next slide, I'd like to go over a few logistics. Please note that participants at HathiTrust events follow our code of conduct, which will also be posted into the chat window. Next slide. We're using Zoom today, of course, and while most of you are familiar with it, I'd still like to highlight a few features and mention how we're using chat and social media today. Next slide. We're recording today's session, and the recording will be available on our YouTube channel. We will also email you a link to the recording after the presentation. To enable closed captioning, please click Live Transcript at the bottom of the Zoom window. Please keep your cameras turned off and your microphone muted throughout today's session. My colleague Erin Elkis will be providing technical support for this session, so for assistance, please send a chat message directly to Erin. Next slide. There'll be time for questions at the end of the presentation. Please type your questions into the chat window, and Angelina Zaitsev, our chat and Q&A monitor, will collect them for me to share with Chris after his presentation. To open the chat window, click the chat button at the bottom of the Zoom screen. Next slide. Finally, please help keep today's discussion going on Twitter or the HathiTrust community Slack space. Now I'll turn it over to Chris Prom for his presentation. Chris?
Great. Thank you so much, Sandra, and thank you all for being here today. I'd like to welcome you all from rainy Champaign, Urbana today, and just let you know I'm very, very happy to be here. The work that I'm going to be describing represents actually the contributions from many people in our library. Everyone shown here directly contributed to this talk, and they're all experts in the ETAS and in HathiTrust in ways that I'll probably never be. But I also want to point out that there are many, many people in the library involved in our efforts around HathiTrust and around access to the print collection, which I'll describe. So before I get into the heart of the talk, I'd like to tell you just a little bit about myself, because I'm actually relatively new to the university library community here as the Associate Dean for Digital Strategies. Although not to the library itself, I've actually worked as an archivist for 20 years in the library. So I'm a little bit new to the Hothi community, the HathiTrust community, and just really interested in learning as much as I can about HathiTrust. And it's been kind of a baptism by fire, frankly, being thrown in with the ETAS work that we've been involved in and that I'll be telling you about today. So with that, just like to get this to move on to the next slide here and point out that the title of this talk is, I guess, a little bit provocative. I'm going to be diving less, I think, into the technical details of our ETAS implementation and experience, and more into the ways in which the ETAS fits into our overall pandemic response strategy, and then finish up with some reflections on what that experience is teaching us, and I hope experiences that we can contribute back to the community in terms of future service directions for HathiTrust. So kind of to get us to that point, I'm going to dive a little bit into some background first about the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, about our library, and about some usage trends that we've seen over the past several years. So in last week's panel discussion, several people pointed out ways in which the ETAS moment really represents the fulfillment of the long-term investment that our community, the library community, and the research library and academic library community has made in building up shared goods and in building, in particular, a digital repository of public domain and in copyright works. So that's a direction that deeply resonated with me as somebody who was trained as a historian, and something that's also very consistent with the ethos and values that speak to our core mission here at the University of Illinois, which is as a land grant university, and one that's been very successful, as many other universities have been, in opening up educational and research opportunities to benefit society as a whole, and in particular to benefit students. So just as one instance of that land grant mission really coming to fruition here on campus is our own testing, saliva-based testing program that we have for COVID and tracking students and so on and so forth. And this is the type of thing that really is a result from many, many years of investment and also strategic focus on campus. So efforts like that one, the COVID tracking one, also I think speak to our value as a large research library and a public research library in particular, and one that's part of an interdependent ecosystem, including HathiTrust. So in one sense, that means that as a library, we rely deeply on HathiTrust, and we also feel that we have the opportunity to play a particularly prominent role in helping build what last week my colleague Lisa Hinchcliffe called a better version of the library than what went before. So that's particularly important to us as we think about the fact that we have 22,000 students who are in class right now, but just online only, so not necessarily on campus and not necessarily able to get access to our print collection. So given all of that as background, this is the type of chart that probably looks familiar to many of you. The bold orange line that we're seeing here is circulation trends for our print collection for the 10 years ending in 2018. You can see it's a story of decline on the one hand, but yet I point out that our library still, as of 2018 and 2019, which isn't shown here, still circulates a massive amount of print collections and print materials. 323,000 initial circulations of our materials in 2019. So here's the point. When the pandemic hit, it's certainly causing the floor to drop out of these print circulations. We won't know how far it drops out until 2020, but we do know that there's an awful lot to be picked up when the pandemic hit and when the floor sort of dropped out there, and HathiTrust is an essential element of that for us. So meanwhile, as you would expect, we, like every other library, has been seeing a massive amount of use of our electronic resources. This chart is just showing ebooks, but I could show a similar one for our journal article downloads as well, showing like maybe 8 million downloads last year. I think the critical thing that I think about as somebody who has a strategic role in the library here is that a lot of the relationship that our users see right now is less directly with the library than it is with the publishers. And I think, we want to keep in mind that publishers and other players in the market, such as some of the internet monoliths like Google, don't necessarily have an interest in representing the value that we've invested in purchasing those collections. I was really disturbed when I heard a couple of weeks ago that certain publishers and Google have been bypassing our authentication systems to provide direct access to some of the content we've licensed. So what that tells me is that it's an important moment for us to invest in the parts of our user experience that are directly controllable by us, and to a large extent, that's print collections or digitized representations of our print collections. From a campus perspective, I'd also like to show some stats here about what's going on. We have, since the fall of 2019, been tracking usage in aggregate sense of materials by people who are off campus by tracking proxy logins and proxy sessions. So one thing you can see is that when we moved into the pandemic, usage of proxy services spiked. And this is a story that we're able to tell the campus, so that even though we're not going to have 4 million entries of people into our buildings during 2020, we have massive use of our collection by people who are off campus. We can see, for instance, that A good percentage of our users are using materials via proxy off campus. So far this semester, we have about 30% of students who have used it at least one or more times. I would expect that by the end of the semester, this will be up to about 70% of students in each college. Similarly, you can see our usage spiking here for all electronic resources via proxy and via federated auth once people come back on campus. So all of this is just background. It's kind of the environment into which our ETAS experience sort of dropped us, increasing electronic usage, particularly for certain sub-communities on campus, when everyone moves off campus at once, but we know we need to provide access to print, which is a critical element for many users in our library. So to kind of cut to the chase, I'd like to just give you a nutshell or an overview of our implementation. As you can expect, with a large research university such as ours, the situation was and remains rather complex. This wasn't made any easier by the fact, quite honestly, that we were doing a catalog migration from Voyager to Alma just at the time when the pandemic hit. But in practice, the decisions that we've made relatively early on have carried us through to the present. I'd like to just very briefly summarize those. First and foremost, at the moment the pandemic hit, it was very clear from messages we were getting from campus and from our own dean that we would have a strong and unwavering commitment to doing a little bit of everything that we do. And that means primarily in terms of our print collection, trying to provide electronic first access whenever possible. Doesn't mean that we'll provide only electronic access, of course, but that we'll try to meet as much access to the print collection through electronic resources as possible. Secondarily, it meant that we took a cascading approach where we steer users either to existing digital content, such as ebooks that we currently license or ones that we may purchase in response to a request for a print copy, or to resources such as HathiTrust. And finally, we committed to locally scanning and providing access for in-copyright works that had not previously been scanned and providing those to users through a restricted access system, but also depositing those to HathiTrust to continue to build up that collection and to allow, hopefully, all of you all to benefit from materials that we've scanned as well. So it essentially accelerated some existing trends that were in place. This slide provides just a little bit more detail about our overall fulfillment strategy. If any of you want more details, I have charts and workflow documents and I can send to you. I'd like to just stress that at this time, we do plan to stick with the ETAs all the way through until the end. In other words, until the pandemic is under control, until our state has moved us into level 5 of our Restore Illinois plan, which essentially is when the virus is controlled and when a vaccine essentially is in place, or until HathiTrust stops providing that service. So we do plan at this time actually to continue with restricted access to the print collection through that point in time. It's worth noting that in order for us to make our overall workflow strategy work, we decided that we had to route all content that's requested by users, any print work, through our preservation services department, so that they can decide either to scan the book at that time or to deliver it to a locker. Again, I would just kind of reiterate that this decision represented for us the value of investing in core infrastructure. Building up that preservation services department is something that, through the excellent work of Jennifer Tepper and my other colleagues in that department, took us essentially 15 years. So just like we rely on the core infrastructure that HathiTrust represents, we in the library were able to rely on some core infrastructure investments that we had previously made. So just a little bit here on Illinois and the HathiTrust ecosystem. We were founding members of the HathiTrust, or there at the beginning, through the vision and persistence of our university librarian at the time, Paula Kaufman. And we've committed ourselves to doing everything we can to help HathiTrust thrive, including contributing as much content as we can through various digitization efforts. You can see we've actually we've contributed quite a few volumes to HathiTrust, and correspondingly have benefited from HathiTrust in an extraordinary time now as well. You can see from our overlap data, we were able to enable an additional 1.9 million volumes for our users, so we have access to about 2.6 total million volumes, or 47% of our print catalog. So while we've contributed a lot, we've also benefited a lot, and vice versa. Just a brief word here about how we provide access to these items. We do have essentially two access pathways. First, through our Easy Search application, which was developed by my colleague Bill Michaud in the engineering library, as well as his colleagues there. We did integrate a direct API call to insert HathiTrust matches against matches in our, what was at the time our ViewFind catalog and what's now Alma. These links, the links that you see highlighted here, probably account for the majority of our click-throughs to HathiTrust items. And we were very happy to be able to take advantage of integrations such as easier authentication pathways, which Jay was able to implement using some of the work that other HathiTrust members had contributed in terms of plugins and so on and so forth. Once Alma and Primo were implemented at the consortia level, which was in late June, we were also able to improve the view of the records in our catalog. But at this point, some gotchas kind of crept in. Specifically, we needed to suppress borrowing of items within the consortia, which led within our statewide consortia, CARLI, which led us to apply a temporary location and to suppress all borrowing for our copies. For our users, you see the temporary location inserting a link to the HathiTrust item here, but then some additional complications crept in that applying the temporary location did nothing to affect the view of the location information for other copies in the consortium. So while we were restricting circulation of our own copies, we also felt it was best to restrict the ability of our own users to request other copies from in the consortium. In other words, if we weren't going to lend out our copies, we wanted to maintain parity within the consortial relationship while ensuring that that we couldn't request other people's copies either. So ultimately, this led us to fully remove the Get It section from Primo and to suppress the holding information completely, which we realized was kind of a kludge and did cause some knock-on effects, which we're still dealing with, particularly in the ways in which our local notes and other information is represented. I'd like to just make a quick note here about usage trends. As this chart shows, the ETAS reports, which we've been very grateful to be getting from the HathiTrust staff, show an increasing amount of usage of the ETAS materials over time as more and more users discover the service, in particular as faculty members begin to do things like include links in their syllabi and so forth. While we're still crunching the numbers, I don't think that the 20,000 plus checkouts that you see here, are picking up a considerable amount of the decline in print circulation that we're seeing, but they're not going to pick up the entirety of it, certainly. So another core element of our plan was an emergency access digitization effort. And as I indicated, we've decided to digitize as much of the requested print that we have as possible. In practice, what that's meant is whenever somebody requests a digital copy, to date, we've been able to digitize it for them. About 13% of the total requests for print items that we've received, we've been able to digitize, basically by taking a workflow that we had and equipment that we had for rare book and special collections digitization and repurposing it. I'd like to be very clear here that we've decided to do our digitization consistent with our contributions to HathiTrust. So we digitize only works that are out of copyright or are in copyright, but where there is no available library license for the e-content. So we think this is defensible and consistent policy framework for a broader lending program for digitized copies of works, should that opportunity develop in the future. In practice, what this means is that within about 10 days or so of somebody requesting an item, it's digitized, they're emailed a link such as this, and they get a one-time or a single user link to the item to view it within our digital library application. And here we were able to leverage again some of those previous investments we had made in viewing infrastructures for our special collections and rare book materials, essentially by putting it into our IIIF Cantaloupe viewer and application that we had previously developed. We do restrict downloading consistent with ways in which downloading is restricted within HathiTrust as well. And then finally, just a quick word here about print fulfillment. In addition to the items that we route for scanning, of course, many books can't be scanned and are delivered via lockers. This slide provides just a snapshot of our activity in that area. You can see that in September, we delivered approximately 920 items to users. And because of the migration with Alma and just because of the general amount of changes that are taking place, we'll be very interested to see how the stats kind of shake out at the end here. So that's an overview of what we're doing. I'd like to close with just a couple of reflections on what the ETAS experience has meant for us and potentially also for the broader community. First and foremost, I think for me at least, and for our library, ETAS has confirmed the value of HathiTrust and of our investment in helping to build up HathiTrust and the general idea of a digital repository of scanned print works. Many people have said this is HathiTrust's moment to shine, and we get a lot of positive comments about that. And we can only agree and thank the HathiTrust staff for, really unlocking the riches of the collection at the moment when it was most needed. All of that said, the restriction on the print collection has led to even more tensions than we had expected, in particular for our users who are deep readers or intensive users of the print collection. Well, not all of these, uncomfortable comments are related to the ETAs. We do have to be very attentive to them. And, in the title of my talk, I asked, is the ETAs in essence propping up current operations? And in one sense, the answer is yes. It's keeping us afloat and alive. It's helping us to deliver the collection. But we can also assume that it points us to the future. In essence, when people submit comments like this, I feel like they're asking for a relatively simple thing: to let each book become that which it was most destined to be for them as an individual user. So by restricting access to the print collection, it has certainly raised those tensions and made it more difficult for them to do that. So, in this sense, I'd like to advocate for and potentially ask that some service enhancements be considered as the ETAS turns less from a temporary thing to something that's more like the new normal. And you can kind of see these listed here. I'm sure these are things that other people have considered, and I realize that the ability to do those is, subject to policy analysis and copyright analysis. But in essence, I think at the end of the day, we should be working toward building a HathiTrust that is, like the books it holds, that which it is also most destined to be, not a limited service, but one that really allows the richness of experience that these digitized works can hold for all of our users. It's kind of a cliche to say that we're not going to be returning to the situation before the pandemic, but we really are living in a transitional moment at a threshold experience. And in the October issue of The Atlantic, journalist George Packer includes this quote, which I think, for me strikes a hopeful note. If you read the article as a whole, Packer argues that most of America's most deepest transformations took place at moments when all bets sort of seemed to be off, when institutions looked like they were pushed to the breaking point, but also when those institutions looked back to their core values and to their guiding principles. And I think for HathiTrust, this is really one of those moments. As part of my own learning experience about the HathiTrust, John Wilkin, our dean here, pointed me back to, and Tom Tepper, who's my colleague here as Associate Dean for Collections, pointed me back to the 2011 Constitutional Convention. And just causes me to reflect that as we've moved millions of volumes into high density storage, as we work toward building out shared print repositories, what some of our users most need is going to be digital copies of those works. And for other users, it's going to be print. So the pandemic should, and I think for me, causes us to reflect on why we built HathiTrust in the first place and how we can, as a community-driven institution, help fulfill our mission to circulate this body of work in the way that our users most want and most need it, whoever they are and wherever they might be. So again, I'd just like to thank you for the opportunity to engage, the opportunity to present our experience, and yeah, just glad to hear from all of you in the time we have left here.
Wonderful, Chris, thank you so much. We do have some questions that have come in. A few of them are for clarifications and a few are for more information about how you're thinking through some of this. So maybe we'll get through a couple of the clarification ones quickly here and then move on. Anna Enriquez asked for clarification about the comment that you made about Google and some publishers had been bypassing authentication to gain access to certain materials. She thought that you meant in the UIUC collection, not in ETAS. Can you explain that a little bit more?
Yeah, thank you, Anna, for that question. That's also my understanding, and I have to confess I'm also investigating a little bit more and beginning to learn a little bit more there as well. But from my understanding, what's essentially happening is that once users have authenticated on a device, Google is aware that they've authenticated on that device, and at that point they pair up the device with the access to the collection as opposed to going through federated auth. That does, from my understanding, affect access to our collection, to our purchased and licensed resources, because these are actually deals that Google has made, from my understanding, with publishers. So it wouldn't be affecting the HathiTrust collection particularly, that I am aware of, unless they found a way to work around that as well, and also know, that our users would have access to Hathi. But I don't HathiTrust, but I don't think so, because that really does require federated auth, from my understanding.
I think that's right too. And then Jeff Kosikoff from Duke asks, on the slide about ETAS usage, you mentioned the total number of users. Is that unique users over the entire time of ETAS, or just users per day totaled?
Yeah, Jeff, thank you for that question. I will have to go back to Esra Koskun, who had tabulated those stats for me. She did take them from the ETAS reports, and I suspect she probably is giving me unique users there, but I'll have to go back to Esra and see what she can report on that one.
Great. And then Chris, we had a couple of questions about the handling of ILL. Francis Malloy asks, if Illinois doesn't lend books within their consortium, what about ILL? Do they take the time to see if the requesting library is a member of HathiTrust and an ETAS user?
Yeah, so we actually are, if you're asking Francis specifically about HathiTrust, books that are, in HathiTrust, we are just blanket not loaning those out via ILL or within the consortium at this point in time.
Great. And I'm going to skip down to the one from David Magier. I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name, David. He's interested to hear more about, or he or she is interested to hear more about the rationale for restricting access to other print copies from your consortium partners, just because your copy is restricted due to ETAS.
Yeah, that's a good question, David. Honestly, that's something that we debated quite extensively here internally, because under the ETAS agreement, we certainly could provide access to those, but we really felt as members of the consortia that we wanted to hold up both ends, of our relationship there. So if we were, in essence, we said, if we're able to if we're not loaning out our own copies, we don't want to place undue burdens on other members of the consortia as well to loan copies to make up for our own, inability to loan those copies to other consortial members. So in essence, as I said, we wanted to be good community members and maintain some parity in the existing consortial relationship. When we were asking for some sacrifices on their end, we didn't want to, ask that they go the extra mile for us.
And then Francis Malloy had an additional question. Did you also implement or consider implementing Alma D?
I'm going to confess I don't know that. I don't think we did. I certainly can ask Michael Norman, who would know the answer to that question, and have Michael get back to you.
Great. I think that's all the questions that we have now, although there were some additional nice comments here. Jeff, and you might have some comment on this, Chris. Jeff had offered, I wonder how this present diminishment of returnables resource sharing is having differential impacts across different disciplines. Do you have any reaction to that?
Yeah, that's a really excellent question, Jeff. I do know through some of the comments that we've received that in particular, the whole pandemic situation has placed many more burdens on our colleagues in the humanities and social sciences than it has in other disciplines that rely less extensively on print. You saw sort of a representative sample of some of the comments that we received there, and those are pretty much coming from our humanities colleagues. We've had some tensions to negotiate there, and I expect that to kind of continue. One of the things we're interested in doing, and we haven't had the time to do this yet, is trying to find out whether our HathiTrust ETAS usage in particular has been skewed toward particular disciplines. We kind of have to work backward from the OCLC numbers to our catalog and then run some, subject analytics in order to get us that data, but that's something we're considering doing.
And Carl Lanen had a comment. He says, at UIC, we took the opposite approach. We opened up print circulation and ended ETAS. And we too have gotten plenty of complaints about the diminished online access since April.
Yeah. Yeah, that's kind of the core thing there. I mean, you're going to end up with a compromise no matter which way you do it. For us, just given the fact that we knew a lot of students weren't coming back to campus, and even with the 42,000 students we have that are nominally in residence, we have 22,000 of those who are only in online classes. So that was kind of a determining or a driving factor for us there in making that decision. But, like everything else with the pandemic, the jury's still out on whether it was best, but it's best for us at this moment. I would say we feel good about it.
Well, Chris, there are no more questions in chat. There's some ongoing discussion, and we hope people will take that discussion further. Just want to really thank you for this excellent summary of the experience at UIUC and for sharing your reflections. If you wouldn't mind forwarding us to the last slide, I'll just wrap us up, and thank you so much. Please, I'm just going to let everybody know here that you'll be receiving some more information later today, including a link to a survey. We hope you'll fill that out about your experiences in today's sessions. And we hope you'll jump in on the HathiTrust community Slack space and have some ongoing discussion and comments. If you go there, you may want to @Chris Prom, who's in that Slack space, so that he sees the comments that you're making about this particular session. And with that, we'll wrap it up. Chris, thank you so much for your involvement. It was a real pleasure to see your presentation today. And thanks to all of you who were here. We look forward to our next session as the week proceeds. Thanks, everyone.